I never thought I'd be in this situation, but here I was, staring at Silas as he slid a wad of cash across the table. The dim lighting of his basement room cast long shadows over the bills, making the whole thing feel even more illicit than it already was. "You're serious?" I asked, waiting for the punchline, the smirk, the gotcha that usually followed his wild ideas. Silas leaned back against his chair, arms folded across his chest, his lips twitching in that way they did when he was daring me to do something reckless. "Dead serious," he said. 500 now. 500 when you actually pull it off." I snorted, shaking my head. "Pull what off exactly?" "You know," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "Flirt with him. Get him to admit something. See how far he's willing to go." I scoffed, leaning back. "Silas, that's your dad we're talking about." "So?" He tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "You've seen him. Women throw themselves at him. Men too, probably. You're just confirming something we already suspect." Shook my head, more amused than anything at first. "This is some rich kid shit," I muttered. Silas shrugged, unapologetic. He was a rich kid. Born into money, never had to worry about much, always looking for the next thrill. His father, Marcus Calloway, was the opposite. A well-respected businessman, mid-40s, widowed for nearly a decade. He carried himself like a man who always had a plan, always in control. I had seen him at their house, dressed in tailored suits even on his days off, pouring himself whiskey with the kind of precision that suggested he did everything in life with careful calculation. And now, for some reason, his son wanted me to test his boundaries. "I don't get it," I said. After a moment, "You want to catch your dad in something?" Silas exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Look, man, my whole life people have whispered about him. I just want to know the truth. And you," he gestured toward me, "are perfect for the job." I knew what he meant. I wasn't some random guy. I was his best friend, someone Marcus had seen around for years. I was also, well, let's just say I wasn't exactly subtle about my own preferences. The cash sat there between us, a silent challenge. I wasn't broke, but the money was tempting. More than that, the idea of it was tempting. The way Marcus looked, tall, broad shoulders, those sharp green eyes that seemed to see right through you, hadn't gone unnoticed by me. I knew it was wrong, but a dark part of me wanted to know what would happen if I said yes. I accepted the offer, telling myself it was just harmless flirting. Nothing serious. Just a game. That's how I ended up at the gym on a Tuesday evening, knowing exactly where Marcus Calloway would be. Silas had mentioned it before. His dad never missed a session, always there around 7, finishing his routine with a run on the treadmill before heading home. I wasn't a gym rat, but I had enough experience to fake my way through a workout. Besides, the goal wasn't really to work out. When I walked in, I spotted him immediately. Marcus was the kind of man who commanded attention without trying. His presence filled the room, not just because of his build, though that certainly helped. Broad shoulders, thick arms, the kind of strength that came from years of discipline rather than just lifting weights for aesthetics. He had a quiet authority about him, the way he carried himself with certainty, like he belonged anywhere he stepped. Salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed, dark gray athletic shirt hugging his torso, black shorts that showed just enough of his muscular legs to remind me why this wasn't going to be as easy as I thought. I was supposed to be in control here. I was supposed to be setting the trap, but one look at him and I felt that pull. Subtle, dangerous. I exhaled, rolled my shoulders back, and walked toward the weights section, making sure to time it so I ended up at the bench next to him. I started with some light dumbbells, keeping my gaze casual, waiting for the right moment, and then, as if by chance, our eyes met in the mirror. I smirked, lifting an eyebrow. "Didn't expect to see you here, Mr. Calloway." He glanced over, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It's Marcus," he corrected, voice smooth but firm. "I didn't expect to see you here either." I shrugged, trying to be more consistent. Summer's around the corner and I figure I should put in the effort. He gave a slight nod, finishing his set before setting the weights down with an ease that made it clear he was barely pushing himself. "Discipline is everything," he said. "It's not about motivation. It's about commitment." I hummed, pretending to consider that while sneaking another glance at his arms. You've got that whole thing figured out, huh? A short chuckle. At my age, you have to. I leaned in slightly, testing the waters. What age is that? His expression didn't change, but I caught the flicker of amusement in his eyes. Older than you. Smooth. We moved through our workouts separately, but there was a shift now, a quiet acknowledgement between us. I made sure to stretch near him, lifting my shirt just enough to reveal a glimpse of skin. When I walked past, I let my fingers brush against his arm lightly, casually, like it was nothing. But I was watching him. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't move away, but he didn't lean into it either, intriguing. After his final set, he grabbed his towel, wiping his face before glancing at me again. You need a spotter? He asked. I smiled. You offering? His lips quirked at the edges, but he didn't answer, just gestured for me to lie back on the bench. I positioned myself, gripping the bar, and as he stood behind me, hands hovering, just under the weight, I could feel his presence, solid, unwavering. As I lifted, his voice was calm, steady, controlled movements. Don't rush it. It wasn't the words that got me. It was the way he said them. I told myself it was just an act, just a game. But deep down, there was a thrill in this. The way my skin felt hotter under his gaze. The way his voice lingered in my head longer than it should have. By the time I finished, I sat up, exhaling. Thanks for that, I said, wiping sweat from my brow. Marcus nodded, but his expression was unreadable. See you around, he said before walking off. He didn't seem uncomfortable, but he didn't take the bait either. Silas was getting impatient. You have to step it up, he insisted, sprawled out on his bed, tossing a baseball in the air like this was some casual bet, and not a game that involved his own father. It's been a week, and you're barely making progress. Leaned against his desk, arms crossed. I'm playing it smart. You don't just throw yourself at a man like Marcus Calloway. Silas rolled his eyes. Right. Because my dad is such a complex mystery. He sat up, tossing the baseball aside. Come on, man. Just find a way to be alone with him. That's when people show their real selves. It was a reckless thing to say. Maybe that was why it stuck with me. 2 days later, I showed up at their house under the guise of hanging out. Silas had been my best friend for years, so me dropping by was nothing out of the ordinary. But this time, I had a plan. As expected, Marcus was home, dressed in a crisp navy button-down, sleeves rolled up as he stood in the kitchen, pouring himself a drink. He glanced up when I walked in, offering a polite nod. Silas is out, he said. Said he'd be back in an hour. Perfect. I leaned against the counter, casual. Guess I'll wait for him. I nodded toward the glass in his hand. That, oh, for me? Marcus raised a brow, amused. Do you even drink whiskey? I can start, I said with a smirk. To my surprise, he poured a second glass, sliding it toward me. I picked it up, letting my fingers brush against his for half a second, longer than necessary. If he noticed, he didn't react. I followed him into the living room, where he sat in his usual chair, the one that was slightly more worn than the rest of the expensive leather furniture. His space, his seat of power. I sat across from him, watching as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass, lost in thought. You always this quiet? I asked, breaking the silence. He exhaled a soft chuckle. Depends on the company. Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. I sipped my drink, wincing slightly at the burn. Marcus noticed. It's an acquired taste. I can handle it, I said, setting the glass down. Like you said, it's about commitment, not motivation. That got a small smirk out of him, a rare glimpse of amusement before he leaned back in his chair, gaze sharpening. You've been around my son for years, he said, voice turning more reflective. I remember when you two were just kids, running through this house, breaking things. I laughed, shaking my head. Yeah, I think I still owe you for that. Broken lamp. His smirk faded into something softer. It's strange watching time pass. Silas is grown now. I don't know where the years went. Something in his tone shifted. A weight, a loneliness he wasn't used to admitting. I studied him, taking in the slight tension in his jaw, the way he stared into his glass like it held more than just whiskey. This was the moment. The vulnerability. You ever think about getting out? There again? I asked. He glanced at me. Dating? I nodded. He scoffed, shaking his head. It's complicated. It doesn't have to be. His eyes lingered on me for a second too long, just long enough to make my pulse spike. I leaned forward, elbows resting on my knees, my gaze locked onto his. I think you just like making things complicated. His lips parted slightly, as if he were about to say something, but then he hesitated. I had him. I reached out, fingers brushing against the loose knot of his tie. You always this formal at home? I asked, my voice lower, now edged with something I knew he'd recognize. His breathing shifted, just a fraction. I loosened the knot slightly, fingertips skimming the fabric. Then, just barely, touching the warm skin beneath his collar. My touch lingered, waiting for a reaction. Marcus didn't pull away. He didn't stop me. He just sat there, watching, calculating. But the way his chest rose and fell just a bit heavier than before told me everything I needed to know. I could feel the shift between us, the weight of something neither of us wanted to name. And suddenly, this wasn't just about money anymore. The night was quiet, the house still except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Marcus and I sat across from each other in his home office, a room that smelled of aged leather and expensive whiskey, the dim lighting casting soft shadows over his face. Our glasses were half empty, the conversation between us drifting into places neither of us had expected. He had been talking about his life, his regrets, the choices he never made, the loneliness he didn't admit to out loud. Somewhere along the way, the careful distance between us had shrunk. If I were younger, maybe things would be different, he murmured, swirling the amber liquid in his glass without looking at me. Something in my chest tightened, the air between us thickened. Different how? I asked, my voice quieter now, laced with something even I wasn't sure how to name. Silence. Not the kind that felt empty, but the kind that was filled with everything we weren't saying. I set my glass down, stood, took a slow step toward him. He didn't move, didn't look away. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the weight of the moment pressing against my ribs. My fingers brushed the edge of his desk. If you were younger, I repeated, my voice just above a whisper. Then what? Marcus exhaled, but it wasn't quite a sigh, more like a release of something he had been holding on to for too long. His gaze finally lifted to meet mine, and that was all it took. I leaned in first, slowly, deliberately, giving him time to stop me. He didn't. Our lips met in a slow, cautious collision, like testing the edge of something dangerous, but too tempting to resist. His breath was warm, his lips firm, the taste of whiskey lingering between us. It was a kiss that wasn't just a kiss. It was a question, a revelation. His hands, steady but hesitant, came up as if to push me away, but they didn't. Instead, they hovered at my sides, fingers twitching, like he was at war with himself. The moment stretched, electric, and then he pulled back. Sharp inhale. His eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place, something that looked too much like regret. This isn't right, he said, his voice rougher than before. The weight of reality came crashing down between us. I took a step back, my pulse still racing, my lips still tingling from the ghost of his touch. I wanted to say something, anything, but I didn't trust myself to speak. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, his expression clouded with conflict. You should go. I nodded, my throat tight, my body buzzing with emotions I couldn't sort through. I left before things could go any further. I tried to avoid him after that night. Every time my phone buzzed with a message from Silas, I let it sit unread. Every time he asked to hang out, I made an excuse. I couldn't face his dad. Not after what had happened. And I sure as hell couldn't face him, knowing the game we had been playing wasn't a game anymore. But Silas wasn't the type to let things go. You've been weird lately, he said one afternoon, throwing a basketball at me as we sat in his driveway. Something happen? I caught it, forcing a smirk. Nah, just busy. Right. He eyed me, unconvinced. Then casually, too casually, he said, "So, my dad." My hands tensed around the ball. Silas leaned back on his elbows, watching me carefully. "Did you ever, you know, do what I asked?" I forced a chuckle, shaking my head. "Nothing happened, man." A slow nod. His expression unreadable. "You sure?" he asked. I shrugged. "Your dad's not interested." It was a lie. And I knew, even before the words left my mouth, that Silas didn't believe me. The suspicion in his eyes was sharp, cutting through the easy smirk he always wore. But he didn't press. Not then. I should have known that silence was more dangerous than his questions. When I walked into his house later that week, the air felt different. Heavy. Charged with something I couldn't place. And then I saw Marcus. Standing, near the fireplace, jaw tight, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But his eyes, God. His eyes held something that made my stomach drop. I barely had time to process it before Silas spoke. "You lied to me," he said. The hairs on the back of my neck rose. Silas stood across the room, phone in hand. And then, with a click, he turned the screen toward me. My stomach bottomed out. A video. Grainy, low light. Just clear enough to see me in Marcus's office, leaning in, kissing him. My breath caught. "I set up a camera," Silas said, voice cold. "I had a feeling you weren't telling me everything." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Marcus's expression hardened. "Silas." His voice was firm, warning, but Silas wasn't listening. His attention was locked onto me. "You were supposed to test him, not—" He exhaled sharply, running, a hand through his hair. "You really did it, huh? You actually—" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Silas, save it." His voice was sharp, but beneath it, I could hear something else. Betrayal. My pulse pounded in my ears. I dared a glance at Marcus, but the way he was looking at me, hurt, disappointment, something dangerously close to regret, cut deeper than I expected. He had trusted me, and I had destroyed that trust. Silas let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "You were my best friend." I opened my mouth, but there was nothing I could say to fix this, nothing at all. Marcus's voice was like a blade, sharp and cold. "Was this all just a game to you?" I flinched. It wasn't the anger that got me. It was the disappointment laced, through it, the weight of something breaking between us. "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. "It wasn't—" But Silas cut me off with a smirk. "Come on, Dad. We both know what this was about." He gestured toward me like I was nothing, more than a pawn in his game. "Guess we know the truth now, huh?" I turned to him, my stomach twisting. He looked satisfied, like he had won some twisted bet. But as my gaze flicked back to Marcus, I saw the way his shoulders tensed, the way his lips pressed into a hard line. This wasn't the reaction Silas had expected. His father's pain wasn't the victory he thought it would be. Marcus exhaled, slow and controlled, but I could see it, the storm behind his eyes. His attention snapped back to me. "You went along with this," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less cutting, knowing what it meant. I opened my mouth, but the words caught in my throat. What could I even say? I had accepted the offer. I had stepped into this willingly. But what I hadn't realized, what I had been too blind to see, was that somewhere along the way, the money had stopped mattering. It had never been about that. It had never been just a game. "I didn't mean to hurt you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus let out a quiet, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "You expect me to believe that?" Silas folded his arms, watching us both, the smirk still playing at his lips. But it didn't reach his eyes. For the first time, I saw it. He didn't expect this either. He had wanted to prove something, to confirm his suspicions, but he hadn't expected his father to care, and he sure as hell hadn't expected me to. The realization settled in my chest, heavy and undeniable. I had feelings for this man. It had never just been about the money. I left that night, the weight of guilt heavy on my chest, suffocating every breath. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Weeks passed, and I heard nothing from either Marcus or Silas. Each day dragged on in a blur of regret, the memories of that night replaying over and over, sharp and clear. I kept thinking about Marcus, his disappointed eyes, the way he looked at me like I was a stranger. I never expected to hurt him like that. And the ache in my chest was constant, a reminder of everything I'd ruined. Then, one evening, a text appeared on my phone, breaking the silence. It was from Marcus. The message was simple. "Can we meet?" My heart skipped in my chest as I read it, my mind racing. I didn't hesitate. I responded with a time and place, not knowing what to expect, but desperate for some kind of resolution, something to lift the weight from my shoulders. We met at a quiet cafe, the kind with dim lighting and soft jazz music playing in the background. It was the same place Marcus and I had gone before, just a normal spot for coffee and conversation. But this time, everything felt different. Tension hung in the air between us, the unspoken words thick with meaning. Marcus sat across from me, his face unreadable. He took a long sip of his coffee before placing the cup down carefully, his fingers brushing the edge of the mug as if he was stalling, choosing his words carefully. "Was any of it real?" he asked, his voice low, steady. The question hung in the air like a challenge, an invitation to either confirm his worst fears or give him something to hold on to. I didn't have to think about my answer. It came out, raw and simple. Yes. There was a long pause. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the way his jaw tightened, as if he were struggling to reconcile what I had done with the truth of what I was saying now. I wasn't sure if he believed me, but the weight of his gaze told me he was trying to understand, to make sense of what had happened. But there was no instant forgiveness, no grand romantic ending. Instead, there was something else, a quiet understanding, a crack in the wall between us. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't enough to fix everything I had broken, but it was a beginning. Neither of us said much more that evening, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. We shared a few more words, small and tentative, but they were words that mattered, and in that moment, I knew we weren't done. There would be no sweeping gestures, no promises made in the heat of the moment. But as I left the cafe that night, there was a part of me that felt lighter, like the first step toward whatever would come next.